Hello and welcome to Arvos of Harvo for September. This is going to be a bit of a shorter episode. I actually finished reading my 7 books, I know this is 6, in about 17-ish days, and for the rest of the month I'm going to be jet setting on a holiday to America. There's not really a theme to the books that I read this month, it's mostly just things that are a bit shorter and easier to get through so that I don't need to worry so much about the big long doorstoppers that are looming at me over my bookshelf. Number 1 is the aesthetic cover for the month. This is A Pale View of Jules by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm a huge fan of this reprinting of his novels because look at how great that looks. The little window and the color scheme and everything's really cool. I wish I had the collector's edition, but they are a bit pricier. This one was his first novel, and it's kind of hard to find now. It's not as popular as any of his other works, and I think it's also a little bit more challenging than his other works. It is the shortest of his novels. This edition's only something like 180 pages, but the narrative is not very straightforward. Just like his other novels, it's non-linear, it's got an unreliable narrator, it jumps back and forward between Japan and England, and it follows Etsuko, who is... In England, she's a mother who's lost one of her children, and there's a really tragic backstory to her, but it also connects with her younger experiences in Nagasaki, where she meets a young woman named Sachiko, and Sachiko and her daughter Mariko have a strained and kind of strange mother and daughter relationship that has some kinds of thematic or tenuous connections to Etsuko as well. This is a little bit more ambiguous than some of the other Ishiguro novels that I've read. The symbolism here is a bit stronger, and the relationship with English and Japanese culture I feel is more apparent because I imagine this is how his work started out, is that he started writing about Japan and then he branched out to be more universal. And so this one does require a bit more knowledge about Japanese history. It is also, just because of its length and because of the way that it relates to its characters, a little bit more dense and difficult as well. You do kind of have to make some theories about how certain events are connected to others. There are issues with the timeline, which is part of the experience of reading his work, that you will need to piece together and actually think what is true or what is accurate and what is possibly fictionalized or sensationalized. And I understand that for some people this is really the pleasure of reading a work like this, but I find that his later works are ones where this style is much more refined. You still have the experience of piecing things together, but it's more emotional, it's more straightforward, it's easier to connect to the characters in something like The Remains of the Day or The Buried Giant. This one is also, to me, a little bit more melodramatic. I feel like it tackles more difficult topics than some of his later works, and it doesn't really have the same sense of delicacy. So I think this is interesting if you like this author and you like his style and you want to see where the origins come from, but I wouldn't rank this on the best of the works of this author, so I would give it a 3 out of 5. Book number 2, my slowpoke for September. This is Normal Heel by Sally Rooney. Everybody knows this book, everyone's talking about this book. Sally Rooney just absolutely exploded in popularity over Book Talk, over the internet, over Instagram, everywhere, right? She is, to me, I think one of the most successful crossover authors that I could relate to, because this novel, to me, it appeals to romance fans, it appeals to genre fans. It's a very fast-paced narrative, but it also has a bit of a literary bent. And whereas I think some novels that try to do the crossover between literary and genre have trouble reconciling the two sides, I think for the most part, Normal People is quite successful. So you can read this as a literary novel to try to understand its characters and the setting. It's very strongly based around regional Ireland, and it uses themes of class and class conflict to reinforce the romance narrative. Or you can read this as a more straightforward will they or won't they. So we follow Connell and Marianne, two young people in, I believe, I don't know if it's named. It's a small town in Ireland. And Connell is very working class. His mother had him when he was a teenager, and so he is a little bit aloof, a little bit distant. He's introverted, and he has, well, he doesn't have trouble fitting in high school, but after he graduates and he wants to go to university and study further, he does have trouble fitting in with societies that aren't as connected to his background. Compared that to that with Marianne, who grows up as the most affluent individual in that small town, but she is ostracized because of her family dynamic, the traumas that she's experienced in the past, and also just the sheer difference that you get when you are from a particular social class compared to everyone else. These are both characters who, in their environments, are often misfits, and so over the course of the novel, they gravitate towards each other, but they are also strained in their relationship. They can't have a really clean and straightforward relationship because of expectations that one has about the other, the different kinds of trajectories of their lives, that it's almost as if they're fated towards each other. They're gravitating towards each other. They can't really let the memory of each other go, and yet various social pressures keep them apart. So it's a very, in some senses, melodramatic, in some senses, tragic story where we have these characters who both deeply want to be together and also cannot reconcile the differences between them. I've seen some people say that this is a very frustrating novel, and I think in some ways I agree, because it is definitely a novel where midway through you can just be thinking to yourself, like, just talk to each other, just like have a conversation and iron out your differences. The fact that it doesn't is the reason why the novel protracts itself and goes for as long as it does. I do agree that I think for some people, after a while, you kind of just give up. You just go, well, there's no point. You're beating a dead horse, right? You're chasing a carrot that will never arrive, so just be happy with someone else. And the inability of these characters to be happy with anybody else is one of the core causes of conflict in this text. So I read it mostly as a literary novel. I think the most interesting thing this novel does in terms of its literary qualities is its perspective. It has a semi-omniscient, semi-third-person limited perspective. It actually jumps back and forth between only the heads of Connell and Marianne. So all the other characters, we don't get their thoughts, but whenever Connell and Marianne are together in a scene, we get both their thoughts. We'll jump back and forth between them. And so, as the reader, I feel like we kind of occupy the psychological space between these two characters. And that really reinforces the book's themes of the fact that these two are meant to be together, and they're gravitating towards each other. I think that works so well. It's such a deliberate choice. It's not really something that I've noticed in other works. But in this book, the perspective just feels so well chosen, so well crafted. And in the same way too, the narrative structure, the chronology isn't really interesting, because every chapter begins with a jump in time. So for example, you'll get one that's like 3 months later. And the way that this works is it'll jump forward, and then it'll give you a little flashback to fill in what happened in that space. And then it'll jump forward again, and it'll give you a little flashback. And so we experience these characters' lives not in a linear fashion, but actually in terms of memories and life events. So when we jump back to the next event, we have characters reflecting on how they got to this point, and whether they're closer or whether they're more distant, we are interested in how that came about. And for the way the novel is constructed, I think this works really well to give you that sensation. Now, I will really criticize the ending. I don't want to give away too much, but I think that the ending leans more towards the genre side of things than it does towards the literary side of things. I don't mean that I think it needed to have an extremely tragic ending, which I know that is the cliche for a lot of literary works, but I would have liked something that was less tropey. I don't know if that gives away too much, but I don't know. I just feel like the ending just wasn't as sharp or as intricate as the rest of the novel. I think Sally Reid's writing style is fantastic. It's very crisp. It's very easy to get through. I finished what is a decently length book at maybe about 1 or 2 days. Very, very compulsive, very easy to read. But when you get to that ending, I just kind of wanted something more complex. But yeah, that's it. I would give it a 3 out of 5. Next one is The White Book by Han Kang. This one absolutely broke me. This is so short. It's hard really to say what it is, because it's a bunch of little fragments. Some people will call it prose poetry, some people will call it autofiction. It may or may not be memoir. There's a lot of playing around with truth here, but we have the narrator who is reminiscing about thinking about the sister that she had, where her mother gave birth years before she was born, and the child only lived for a few hours. And that's a very, very sad and tragic situation. But the discovery of this links to her own experiences going to Warsaw, traveling around the world, and every white thing that she sees. This book just transfixes you in that sadness. It's not just sadness for sadness' sake. It's using this event, which I think is quite distant for a lot of people. A lot of people don't really think about losing a child much, right? It's not really a tragedy that we think about until it happens to us, if it happens to us. But this book really, really made me feel that hollowness, that really crushing all-encompassing sadness that comes with it. It's only about 10,000 words, but for the entire time, it's so meditative, it's so detailed, and the images they choose are so sparse but so intricate. It just really, really held me, it really gripped me, and by the end of it, I was just absolutely a wreck. I was so emotional by the end. I'd never read a book so short that could do that to me so quickly, but honestly, by page 3, page 4, I was already feeling it. It's really, really well done. The translation from the Korean by Deborah Smith is also interesting. I've heard things about Deborah Smith, especially with The Vegetarian. This one, to me, feels quite poetic in English, so I really wonder how the nuances of language came across, but I don't know Korean, so I can't really give a good estimate of that. All I can say is that it really works. If you want to be sad, and you're okay with, in many ways, the very traumatic story of losing a child very young, this book will give you so many feelings. Oh my goodness, I'm still reeling from it, really. It's very, very good. It is a 5 out of 5. Book number 4 is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I only realized that I read the bad translation after finishing it, because I actually didn't know that this was translated from French. I was quite ignorant about it. I only started noticing because the characters are talking in French towards the end, and I thought, wait a minute, this is English. This edition actually doesn't even say who the translator is, and if it doesn't say who the translator is, it is a good chance that you have the Louis Mercier translation from the 1800s, which is, among Verne fans, absolutely reviled. Like, it cuts out so much, it mistranslates a lot of things, people do not respect this translation at all, and I didn't notice it. I thought it was fine. But maybe there's a better version out there, I have no idea. This is what I read though, and the hint that I've been told is that if the first line contains the word signaling, so I have, the year 1866 was signalized by a remarkable incident. If you see that word signalized, I've seen someone just say, drop this copy and go find something else. I don't know, I don't really have strong opinions about translation, but yes, I think if the community, the people who genuinely like Jules Verne, say that this edition is terrible, then maybe you don't get it. That being said, this is interesting because it's one of the few sci-fi books I've read that seems to actually like technology. So I feel like the cliche with sci-fi nowadays is, oh, look at human hubris, look at how bad technology can get. This is one where Captain Nemo has built a secret submarine going around the world, and a lot of this book is very optimistic. A lot of this book is the narrator, is his name Charles? Professor Aronnax? He is on submarine, the Nautilus, and he is just experiencing the undersea wonders, and he's just filled with awe and respect for the ocean. And a lot of this book is built upon the capabilities of technology to actually help us better understand the world and to show us things that are more delightful about nature that we could ever have experienced. So for the most part, this book is very, very optimistic. Only towards the end, it gets a bit more dramatic, but another flaw I could really say with this, I don't know if it's the translation or just the narrative itself, it doesn't have a real straight arc. So what happens is that there's rumors of this giant narwhal that's destroying ships, and our characters, Professor Aronnax and his like manservant or his helper, Conseil, and a harpooner named Ned Land, they get shipwrecked when they are trying to, or they get thrown off the boat when they're trying to find this mysterious narwhal, and then they get captured and put on the submarine by Captain Nemo. And so they spend all this time in the submarine. Some of them are trying to escape, some of them are just kind of enjoying the time there, and they just go around the world. They go to all these different places. They go to Pacific Islands, they go to the Antarctic regions, they go to all these different places. They look at animals, they enjoy the environment. That's it, right? It's just kind of nice. And I think one of the reasons why it feels optimistic too is that Conseil is honestly one of the most... He's the biggest bro in fiction that I've read so far. I think this is maybe a theme of Jules Verne, because I know that Around the World in 80 Days had Passepartout, who's basically the same thing, just like an absolute bro. At any point where the protagonist is in any sort of danger, Conseil like comes in and saves the day, right? The story begins with Professor Aronnax being thrown from the boat, and Conseil jumps into the water to save Professor Aronnax. Like, he's just such a bro, and that means that you never feel like you're in danger, because at any point, if Professor Aronnax is worried, you've just got Conseil there. He's just going to do whatever it takes to save you, so things are great. And because of that, You don't feel a lot of tension, you don't feel a lot of drama, you do get a little bit of mystery because you don't know who Captain Nemo is or what his motivations are, but you're traveling around the world. It's not even as if there's some sort of large quest that we're trying to follow. And a lot of the conflicts are incidental, like, whoops, we accidentally sailed into some ice, or whoops, we accidentally sailed into some octopuses, or whatever. Like, a lot of the conflicts are incidental, which means that when you get to the end, you just feel like you've been on an adventure, and at some point adventures need to end, and it's just a neat time for that to happen. So, yeah, it's okay, it's alright. I wish that it was a little bit more structured. I did think the descriptions of the ocean were really fantastic. Like, I even folded a page because I liked it so much. I know this is the bad translation version, but this is describing Captain Nemo and how much he loves the ocean and why he decided to build a submarine. He says, "The sea is everything, covers 7/10 of the terrestrial globe. Its breath is pure and healthy, is an immense desert where man is never lonely, for he feels life stirring on all sides. The sea is the only embodiment of a supernatural and wonderful existence. It is nothing but love and emotion. It is the living infinite, as one of her poets have said. In fact, Professor Nature manifests herself in it by her three kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, and animal. The sea is the vast reservoir of nature. The globe began with sea, so to speak, and who knows if it will not end with it." I keep reading from that passage because it's so lovely, it's so gorgeous. It genuinely loves the ocean, and this is one of the things that I was looking for when I was doing this category of aquatic texts, is that sometimes the ocean, sometimes water, is just such a powerful metaphor that it overtakes a text and makes it really remarkable, and this is a good example of it doing that. Now, that's mostly in the beginning. Some really strange and messed up things happen towards the end. I get the sense that Jules Verne, after a while, either got to the end of his knowledge about the ocean and just started making some stuff up, or he wanted to sensationalize things a bit more to entertain his audiences. I don't really know. But after a while, you just feel like it's getting a bit repetitive. You feel like the journey's gone for a bit too long. I was actually a bit thankful when the novel finished because I was like, oh, it's done, right? Where else in the ocean could they go? So I would give it a 3 out of 5. Book number 5, this is my on-premise. This is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi. Wonderful, wonderful book. Really, really excellent. So the premise is that it's set in Iraq, and it's about a kind of like a tale teller. He's someone who just collects stories named Hardy, and he collects body parts from explosions and other, or just like corpses around Baghdad, and he stitches them together into a person. And his motivations for doing this aren't fully clear, but he says to his friends or anyone who will listen to him that he does this so that he can make a full person as an embodiment of the damage and the violence that's happening around him. So whereas he can see a body part from an explosion and not think of it as human, not think of it as a victim, by making a human being out of these parts, he wants people to recognize that actually bad things are happening, and there needs to be a sense of justice to rectify what's happening so far. So we have this character of Hardy. We also have a lot of other characters just in the immediate surroundings. We have Mahmoud, who is a reporter currently staying at a hotel in the area. He is someone who becomes very interested in the story of the monster here is called What's His Name, becomes very interested in What's His Name and tries to follow and track his movements across the city. We also have the first character we meet is named Lishva, who was a mother whose daughters had moved away to Australia, but she's mourning her son who passed away, I think almost 20 years ago before the start of the text. And so when What's-His-Name comes to her, she decides to give it her son's clothes and start calling it her son's name of Daniel. And what this monster really is it's actually the vengeance of all the people who have died in these unjust ways, wanting to try and enact some kind of justice on Earth. And the way it does this is, like in the original Frankenstein, through violence. It wants to kill the people responsible for the deaths of the bodies that are within it. But the way that it does that, and the way that it can really enact justice, I think this is the most interesting link to the original Frankenstein, is that it's not a perfect figure. It's not a divine figure of justice. Instead, it doesn't really understand how best to do it. Just like in the original Frankenstein, where the monster is awakened with a sense of justice and realizes that he should not be treated in the way that he is, but he doesn't know how best to interact with the world, and he can't solve the problem of everyone around him treating him like a monster, and violence begets more violence. A very similar thing happens here. So whereas What's-His-Name
comes to life knowing that he wants to enact justice and to prevent further violence in Baghdad. His actions end up just creating more violence. He needs to keep himself alive, and he enlists the help of a few individuals, I think there's a scientist and a military contractor and a magician. There's fortune tellers, there's people who try to assist because they all have their own views of what is just or what is the best way to rectify the violence in Iraq. And it's just so tragic the way that these different motivations can't get along, and because of previous violence and because every character has a different view of what justice should be, this results in this Frankenstein's monster. It results in this thing that is very powerful and is very adept at using violence, but it's not able to solve the situation that it's in. If anything, it's just creating more violence. It's creating more reasons to enact violent justice, and it really does read like a political satire of Iraq and a lot of the foreign policy in the Middle East. It's really indicting, and it's quite thrilling as well from a narrative standpoint. I think it works so well as both a thriller and a science fiction text and a work of political satire and comedy. I think as a black comedy even, it works very well. It works on so many levels, there's so many different ways you can read it, and although the start is a bit difficult because there are a lot of characters for what is quite a short book, after a while you really start to realize why you need all these characters, because every major event in the novel is explored from more than one perspective. We have different characters making their own take on what's his name, on the various terrorist attacks that are happening around Baghdad. Each situation has different ramifications and different impacts for each of the characters, which lends to the complexity. You get a sense that this novel is trying its best to see the conflict from a higher angle than just any one individual perspective, and that means that it has the complexity to show audiences just how misguided one individual's perspective can be. And I think it works really, really well. It's a very fantastic read. I give it a 5 out of 5 as well. Okay, and last book for September. This is my published in 2023. This is How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney. Now, the Booker Prize nominees of 2023 are very Irish focused. I think there's 4 authors from Ireland who are on the Booker Prize long list, and Elaine Feeney is one of them. How to Build a Boat is, in many ways, I'm very glad I read it in the same month that I read Normal People. It's a great companion piece to that, whereas Normal People is kind of a hybrid between literary and romance. How to Build a Boat is almost entirely literary. There is a bit of a romance subplot, but even that is exploring the nature of relationships as a thematic device and not just giving audiences the desire to see characters end up together. We follow, for the most part, a young boy named Jamie. He is the son of Owen, who also was a father in his teenage years, and Jamie's mother, Noelle, passed away very sadly in childbirth. And so Jamie, he's working his way through the world, trying to figure out the meaning of this. As a teenager, he is very coded to have, I interpret it as autism, possibly Asperger's. He has challenges with interpreting the motivations and the cues of people around him, and he is very focused and fixated on things like mathematics and trying to figure out the meaning of his memories of his mother and trying to better understand that. His quest through the novel is to build a perpetual motion machine, and 2 teachers at the school, one named Tess and one named Tague, they help him by building a boat. They build a traditional boat from the region, and this exercise brings together these characters from all very traumatic backgrounds. It forces every character into introspection of their own family connections and how they came to be, how they arrived at where they are. Each character is working through their own little thing as well. I think that's what makes this book work so well compared to Normal People, for me at least, is that I'm more of a literary reader. I like to read in terms of themes and in terms of feelings. I like to get a sense of emotion from understanding real characters rather than seeing plots unfold the way that they do. So this book, in some ways, is a bit more challenging than Normal People because it doesn't have clear plot threads. It doesn't have a arc that goes all the way. Well, it does in the boat, but it does also have a lot of offshoots. It has moments where characters reflecting on their own lives give a bit of backstory and help us better understand who they are and how they got to where they are, without really feeding towards an overarching narrative. Instead, what ends up happening is that you feel like these are characters that have always existed. They've existed before the story began, and they will continue to exist when the story ends. But we are just interested in certain very poetic moments of their life, where we truly understand who they are, and where they have to reconcile with assumptions or inaccuracies or traumas that linger from their past and still impact on how they see the world today. I thought that the depth of writing here was really fantastic. I don't know, I always have some issues with characters that are coded to be autistic, because in some ways I feel like the way that's communicated to us is through the narration of a character who just speaks in unusual ways or speaks in really formal diction. That's what happens here. It's not to the same level of egregiousness as something like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, but it does still distance us from this character, and I don't know how I feel about it. I can't really talk about it too much myself because I don't have experience, but it is really a key component to this novel, and it depends, well, it may hinge on how you enjoy it. And one thing I do like about it, though, is that it's a novel by a poet, and every novel by a poet that I've read so far I've really enjoyed, because I think it just speaks to the kind of nerdy reader that I am. Every now and then when things get too emotional, it just becomes poetry. It just starts getting line breaks. It just starts getting more and more beautiful. And that to me is always very enjoyable. I think the emotional payoff towards the end of the novel is just so much stronger. I think I respect the ending here so much more, because it does give you beauty, and it does show you how that beauty is achieved through relationships and communication and overcoming past struggles, but it doesn't give you an easy answer. And it continues to make you think and remind you that these characters will continue to exist and continue to struggle through what they've still been struggling through all of their lives. But it gives you this one small, fleeting, beautiful moment to linger on and to be satisfied with until these characters have to face whatever struggle later on. I think it just works really well. And do I think it's the best book of 2023? Do I think it's going to win the Booker Prize? I don't know. I think it's the only thing that I've read on the long list, so I don't know if I'm going to read another one from that this year. One of the reasons why I actually wanted to start making these videos was because of Adam Khan's video where he read all 12 long-listed books for the 2022 Booker Prize. I thought about doing that this year. I knew I would not succeed, and so I did not even bother trying. But it is a nice feeling, right? It is a nice feeling to read something published in this year and wonder if some award body, not that I really respect the awards and saying what is the best and what is the worst, but if collectively a group of panelists would say, yes, this was the best book that came out this year, it's interesting. I would give this a 4 out of 5. I don't know how much I will think about it next year, the year after that, or anything like that. Even if it wins, I think it would be a nice book, but not necessarily one that will linger for decades. But sometimes that's all you need, right? Sometimes it's nice to just grab a book and have a good experience, learn a bit more about some characters that you come to really care about, and then let it go. So that is How to Build a Boat. Number 7, I do not have it with me because I read it on Gutenberg, but Agnes Grey is my ABCD for the month. It is Anne Bronte's novel, which I've actually never read anything from Anne Bronte. I've read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, I've read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I don't know anything about Anne Bronte, and I wasn't sure about what I was going to experience. I've seen that Agnes Grey has been called quite underrated, but I also picked this one because I know it's the shortest of all the works across Austen and Bronte and Dickens and Collins. Actually, I don't know if it's shortest among Austen, but I finished them all. Anyways, if you read Victorian literature, then it's really hard to escape the idea of a governess. So when children are being raised, especially when they're upper-class children, they don't go to school. Instead, they have a governess who is kind of like a private tutor, kind of like a servant, but someone who is responsible for the education and upbringing of these children, both in terms of their intellectual capabilities, but also their moral capabilities, because a lot of Victorian parents are bad parents. So they do not have healthy relationships with their parents, because their parents are busy either doing work or traveling the world or doing whatever Victorians do. And so the kids are raised by the governess. This creates such an interesting power dynamic, because the governess is an employee of the parents, and yet they have the determined role of actually raising the children, giving them moral instruction. How do you enact authority in the situation when, as a governess, you're kind of a lower class figure. You're a woman who needs to work for their living compared to the children who will be raised as a bunch of aristocratic people who never need to work a day in their lives, right? So what does that mean? How does that affect relationships in that kind of household? I found that the novels that I've read so far that do involve governesses, Emma, who has a very great relationship with her governess, Miss Taylor, and Jane Eyre, who becomes a governess and also has a fairly good relationship with Isabel, they have a very idyllic view of this governess-student relationship, and I was always very curious to see, actually, in this imbalance of power and social capital, how does the governess role look in reality when things aren't so idyllic? And Agnes Grey is that novel, basically. Agnes Grey is about a woman from a somewhat lower class background. Their parents married for love, but they don't have a lot of money, and so Agnes decides one day that she's going to become a governess because she's good with kids, she has a good education, she knows all the basics of mathematics and reading and Latin and all the things that are important. And so she goes, yeah, I can do this. And the children that she gets matched with are just the devil. Like, they are just awful, awful kids. They are terrible, terrible to her. They also just do everything to make you dislike them. They harm animals, they are dismissive, they enact their wealth over Agnes, they make her feel terrible all the time, and they have no signs of moral improvement at all. And so the first three children that Agnes is in charge of are quite young. They're, I think, around 4 or 5 years old, and they're just absolute terrors. They're out of control. And well, the parents have no idea what they're going to do, and the parents have no interest in actually teaching their own kids. They instead expect that Agnes will do everything perfectly, and yet the parents have this horrible behavior where they forgive the kids for everything because they're the kids, but they do not let Agnes have any leeway. So if Agnes is being too strict with the kids, they'll criticize her. If Agnes is being too lenient with the kids, they'll criticize her. But it means that she can't actually do anything meaningful, and she just gets treated terribly the entire time. This initial connection with this initial family concludes in a few chapters, and then she moves on to another family, where the daughters are a bit older. They're, I think, 17 and 15, but they're also still terrible people. And one thing I just couldn't get with this novel is that everybody's terrible except for Agnes. Everybody's awful, and it suggests that, well, to me in some ways it feels like a revenge novel written by someone who was not of the upper class and just wanted to absolutely roast people from the upper classes. And I get that. Like, I personally am not extremely well off, and sometimes it is very enjoyable to read a novel that just absolutely roasts the ultra rich, right? I totally get that. But I think the moral complexity here is just a bit too simple. Like, there's not any redeeming quality for the children, to the point where anything they do, you just kind of assume that it's some kind of thing that's meant to torment Agnes. And Agnes, meanwhile, doesn't do anything wrong. Like, she has no real faults of her own. And the whole time, you get the sense that Anne Bronte is trying to make you love Agnes, hate the kids. I just felt really frustrated. I just wanted more complexity to it. I had realized the reason why I did enjoy Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre so much is that they both have a sense of moral complexity. Jane Eyre, because she's in love with Mr. Rochester, but Mr. Rochester is a conflicting figure. He has some good and some bad to him. And with Wuthering Heights, we have that ultimate power of emotion and connection, but it's counterweighted with just how terrible of people that Heathcliff and Cathy are. When you come to Agnes Grey, it's so much clearer. It's just these characters good, that character bad. It's less interesting to read, and it just becomes wearisome after a while. Now, it does recover. I thought the ending got a bit stronger. It does feel like a generic Victorian novel in that they do end up going into a more romantic subplot, and if that's something that you're interested in, that's fine. You know, that works fine. But it is absolutely not one of my favorites of this genre. I would give it a 2 out of 5. Alright, and that's my 7 books of September. Thank you for joining again, and I will see you next month. And by the way, while I'm on this plane ride, there's a 24-hour plane ride down there and 24 hours back, I thought to myself, why not try and tackle this, A Suitable Boy? So now that I've finished Gravity Rainbow, I have to work through my difficulty wheel. Rather than spin the wheel this time, I thought, I've got this much time. When else am I ever going to finish this horrifyingly long novel? This edition is 1,473 pages on very small font, and it is a
something like 600,000 word novel. That being said, I've heard that the narrative itself is quite straightforward. It is a generational epic set in India, and I would hope that I understand Indian literature a little bit better just from having read a few more works from the region, but hopefully I can get through it. Hopefully it's something that I can tick off the list, and let's see how it goes. If you never hear about this book again, just assume that I failed and don't bring it up, but hopefully when I come back I can make a video of I've read A Suitable Boy and you should too.